Welcome to another edition of Around the Town with Hez Brown. And now your host, Hezekiah Brown.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Around the Town with Hez Brown. This bi-weekly community affairs show will present issues and information that affects you. If you have any comments or ideas for a future show or topic, reach us on the WRVS-899 Facebook page or on Twitter. Use hashtag Around the Town. Good afternoon, Dr. Cartner.
Good afternoon, Hez.
This is Around Town with Hez Brown, and we're certainly glad to have you. We appreciate you taking your time out of your busy schedule to join with us today. And this is really going to be a conversation with Dr. Cartner regarding the Elizabeth City School District. So we will start off by just asking you a few questions. You certainly give us your full name.
My full name is Larry Wayne Cartner.
And then you're married, you have children?
I am married, fortunate to be married to my wonderful wife for 37 years. We have two children. One is a physician's assistant in Kernersville, North Carolina, and the other is a geologist in Wilmington.
That's success. They didn't become superintendent of schools, right?
No, they went another way.
Okay. How long have you been in Elizabeth City? How long have you held your position as superintendent?
2 years and 4 months.
2 years and 4 months, okay. And where were you previously employed?
Previously, I was most recently with the Department of Public Instruction. Worked with them for 2 years as in the turnaround division, working with the lowest 10% of schools in the state. Prior to that, I was superintendent in 3 different districts. And prior to that, I was assistant superintendent in 1 district. And prior to that, I had my classroom and administrative experience in Gaston County.
And you work for the Department of Public Instruction. Was that a state job? Work for the state?
It was. It was working for the Department of Public Instruction in their Division of School Transformation.
Okay. So you know a little bit about DPI.
Yes, I do.
Okay. Tell the audience a little bit about what you like and dislike about your job as a superintendent.
Well, the good part of my job is every day I get to go to work with some of the greatest people in the world. When I look at our teachers and our children, it's just phenomenal that I get to go and do this every day. So that's the good part. Watching children grow, watching teachers grow. I think probably the most difficult part of my job is when we have to make weather calls. And folks, everybody has an opinion as to how things should go on a weather call, but there are a lot of things that factor into that decision. And so the thing about a weather call is, it's going to be a 50-50. 50% are going to be glad, 50% are going to be mad. So you go into it and you do the very best you can. But that's probably the most difficult thing I do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Like I say, Superintendent, I know that a lot of times you have to make some time on-the-spot decisions about certain things, and that's one of those things you have to do. But I just want to go back and thank you again, because I don't think I ever did this publicly, was thank you for serving on the committee some time ago. I guess it was last year before last, we spent about 2 or 3 days just looking at what the community asked for. And this was done by virtue of going to all 4 corners of Elizabeth City and listening to the community and seeing what they thought would be better for the school district, better for the children, and so on. And I enjoyed being on that committee, and I think we were very productive on that committee. And so now, a lot of things that came out of that, some goals and objectives came out of that. Where do we stand on most of those? Did we do some of them? We do most of them? Because I apologize for not following up. But how did that work out finally?
Well, what you're referring to, is our strategic planning committee. And we were fortunate to develop that plan with a lot of community input. We did have several forums around the county to listen to what parents and community members had to say. The plan was designed around the 5 goals of the State Board of Education, which we are required to align to. So we worked with those goals, and I am pleased to say that we are ahead in the majority of the indicators. The plan and its progress are posted on our website. And so when you go look at it, if something is colored green, that means we've accomplished it. If something is colored yellow, it means we're in progress with it. And if something is covered red, it means we're still working on it. So again, pleased to say, because of a lot of talented people, we're ahead in the majority of our indicators and are making progress with that.
And if someone wanted to just go out and check out what you just talked about, could they go online and look at these goals and objectives under the strategic plan and
Yes, they could. They can go to our website, ECPPS.K12.NC.US, and that's our homepage. And they simply go there and they can look at the strategic plan and see what has been accomplished thus far. Generally, there's a date by it when it was accomplished. They can see what we're still working on, and they're seeing what hasn't started yet. So, yeah, we welcome them to do that.
Okay, thank you. Again, let's go to some of the issues locally now. As you know, there has been an enormous amount of discussion regarding low-performing schools. What schools are on the low-performing list, and what schools are not on there?
There are 6 schools on the low-performing list. 2 were added this year. The previous 4 from past years. The 2 that were added this year are Central Elementary School and J.C. Sawyer Elementary School. The ones that were on the list previously, P.W. Moore, Pasquotank Elementary, Elizabeth City Middle, and River Road Middle.
I know P.W. Moore dropped from a D to an F, and 3 other schools are rated D. Superintendent, I know this is a difficult question, but I'm going to ask it anyway because I think that, you're the guy to ask for it. How do we get out of this dilemma?
Well, it is important. There are a couple of things to know, Hez. It's important to recognize we didn't get here overnight. We're not going to be able to leave here overnight. You need to remember that school reform is always a marathon. It's not a sprint. So we are working very intentionally with these 6 schools. I think giving a little background is probably helpful with this. First of all, it's important to recognize that in our school district, we can count 11 schools. For the purposes of the state accountability model, we cannot count H.L. Trigg. So we count 11 schools. So it's important for the community to know that 7 out of 11 of those schools met the state growth standard. So remember that. Now, the state growth standard is a year's worth of schooling equals a year's worth of growth. Remember that because it's going to be important in a minute. So how can it be that schools met the state growth standard, but they're called low performing? Well, of those 6 schools that I just mentioned, 3 of them are only on that list because of their school grade. They have a grade of D, And to avoid being on the low-performing list, you have to have a grade of C or better. So I want to invite your listeners for just a minute. Lay your hands out on the table, turn them palms up, and I'm going to show you how that letter grade is calculated and how there is some inherent unfairness in it. So in your left hand, I want you to put the figure 80%. In your right hand, I want you to put the figure 20%. Now, those two numbers represent how a school grade is calculated, but it's what those numbers represent that's important. The 80% represents how a school performed on one day, on one test for all students. So remember that, one day, one test, all students. Now, in and of itself, that's not a bad thing because that measure gives you what's called the proficiency. And another way of saying proficiency is how many of your students are working at grade level. Okay? So we've got proficiency in your left hand at 80%. Now, you remember I said earlier the state standard for growth is a year's worth of growth for a year's worth of school. So you would think that that number would be fairly important, but it only counts for 20%. Let's say a student entered third grade reading at a first grade level. Okay, that same student ends the third grade and is reading at third grade level. That is defined as growth. But that number only counts in your right hand for 20%. So we have, using the state's definition of growth, despite that, we are setting ourselves up, or the state is setting us up for an unfair process. So you got 80 and 20. Now, here's the point. Guess what we know about schools that have large numbers of free and reduced lunch students and students of poverty? Those schools will always show more growth than they will proficiency. Always. Because typically children in those schools come to us with learning deficits, not learning disabilities, but learning deficits. They're behind. So they can always show more growth even if they don't get to grade level. But the state system is not set up to recognize that. So of those 6 schools, 3 are there because they've got a grade of D, and that's based on that 80 and 20. And so it's not an equitable system that recognizes and rewards student growth. In talking about P.W. Moore dropping from a D to an F, and how do we get out of this dilemma? As I said earlier, first we acknowledge we didn't get here overnight, and we're not going to leave overnight. If you look at our performance history as a district, we've been walking a fine line with a low-performing designation for a long time. In our history, we were once in danger of state assistance teams coming into the district, but we worked our way back to avoid those sanctions. The next thing to remember, as I said earlier, again, school reform is always a marathon and not a sprint. One of the things that I want the committee to understand, or the community, to understand, is the difficulty that schools with an F grade will face to get out of that designation. Teachers and administrators are working hard, but they have a huge challenge in front of them. And the reason is this. In order to be removed from a low-performing list, a school must exceed the growth standard and have a grade of C or higher. The problem comes in the fact that it is not enough just to meet growth. No, schools with an F grade have to exceed growth. So you must go from the very bottom to the very top in order to be removed from that list. Again, those are things that we believe the state system is inherently unfair in that a school can meet growth and have to remain on the low-performing list. They must exceed growth in order to get off of that list. You might ask also what we're doing specifically in these 6 schools. Each school is rewriting their own school improvement plan. We are providing additional training for teachers. At most of these schools, instructional budgets have been increased, and we've placed additional personnel there. If a school is low performing and did not receive additional personnel, we did not reduce their existing personnel. So we are meeting with these most needy schools with the greatest amount of new teachers on a weekly basis, and our principals are also providing more feedback, more frequent feedback to teachers regarding their classroom instruction. So those are some of the things that we're doing for P.W. Moore and for the other 5 low-performing schools.
You know, that's the first time I ever heard that explanation of that criteria, and I appreciate what you're saying. But what's the difference between learning disability and learning deficiencies?
A learning deficit and a learning disability. A learning disability tends to be something either mentally or physically or emotionally that we can analyze, that we can diagnose. Typically, if we're referring to a learning disability, it is something that can be helped either medically or psychologically. On the other hand, a learning deficit simply says this child comes from an environment where he or she has not had the exposure to let's say a large vocabulary, the exposure to trips, to see things that are outside of our region, and exposure to things that would prod their thinking and make them cue their imagination, so to speak. That's a learning deficit. Now, we know for a fact that kids from disadvantaged homes come to us basically a year to a year and a half already behind when they enter kindergarten. It's not a learning disability. They can learn. It's a learning deficit because they came from an environment where they didn't have all those advantages. So when we think about learning deficits, we have to think about taking the kids as they come to us in kindergarten. And by the end of 3rd grade, if we haven't erased that deficit, then that student is going just to continue to get more and more behind. And more a rule than the exception, unfortunately, those are the kids that will eventually drop out. And so that's why that K-3 span is so important. Let me ask you a question. In the state of California, do you know how they calculate the space needed for prisons and prisoners? They calculate it based on 3rd grade reading scores. And so, you know, that is both a shocking and sorrowful piece of information. So that's why erasing learning deficits by 3rd grade is absolutely key.
Well, Are you essentially saying, that number you talked about, I'm fully familiar with that number, but it's not only California, but they do it across the country almost. If they start to look at the third grade and they determine how many prisons to build, if kids are struggling in the third grade, they can start to prepare for them come into prison, and that's really disastrous to all of us. So I understand what you're saying. So I appreciate you sharing that information, and I'm not sure everybody in the public understand that. Because if so, I think we'll have more of what we call parent participation. Let me just go to that for a moment. I know that from my experience with you that you've tried as hard as you can to get parents involved in the school system, get grandparents involved, just coming to the schools, maybe just sitting in the classroom, various reading programs. How are we doing with that?
It is a slow victory. I tend to think it in terms of a victory as opposed to why is it taking so long. It's a slow victory. For instance, at our parent academy a couple of weeks ago, we had 35 parents. That's more than we had at the previous one. The parent and family community center that we're now operating goes back to that strategic plan. That was one of the things specifically in that plan that the community wanted to see. We've made sure that staff, there are 2 staffers there, that they are not in the office. They're out in the community. They're going to places and presenting resources for parents and how parents can get involved. So, again, it's a slow victory, but we are making progress. We certainly welcome parents to come to our schools, to volunteer, to listen, to watch, to understand what and how their child is learning so that they can, in turn, do that at home as well.
Yeah, Dr. Cartner, one of the things that I know, as a matter of fact, is that if a kid can learn to read and comprehend, just to read and comprehend, it helps them in 3 areas: English, science, and math. Mm-hmm. So let me just make an appeal on behalf of the school district, on behalf of the superintendent, that if you're listening today, you don't need a master's degree, a bachelor's degree to come into the schools and just sit with the kids, help them, let them read to you. You read to them, but take part in the process, and you will see. You will feel better about yourself. The kids will feel better by seeing some adults around who really care and help them learn to read and comprehend. It helps them in English, science, and math. So please, it doesn't take, all you do is go to any school you want to, designate the time that you can come and sit with these kids, because it's not just the school district responsibility for what's going on in the schools. It's the community's responsibility. So we have to find a way to aid and assist the school. We have to embrace the school district and stop complaining all the time about what's not going on and look at the good thing that's going on, but contribute to the school district itself.
Absolutely.
That's just my plug in there.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Now, let me just go to some other things too that we're struggling with. I know in Elizabeth City and across the state of North Carolina. That is the funding process. I recall reading the newspaper maybe a year ago, or last year, a year before, and I saw where part of cutting the budget was taking out teacher assistants out of the classroom, taking other supportive staff away, and expecting the schools to survive. I just myself, I could not figure out why this was done, because if you ever worked in education, you know how important that teacher's assistant is in the educational system. And it's a very valuable part that I think that's taken away. I don't know where it is now, where it stands, but could you talk about that just a little bit?
Well, when you look at the overall budget of the Department of Public Instruction, unfortunately, what this budget cut and the next one next year are doing is they are cutting the services that are most needed in low-performing districts and schools. And I'll give you an example. You're dealing with an $8 billion budget. So the cuts and reductions roll out over the period of the year. They don't all appear in July. This has been cut. This has been cut. You see those things, but then as the year progresses and you have a call for a specific service from what used to be provided by the state, and you discover that service has been cut, and that's the first you're hearing of it. So that's what I mean when I say it continues to roll out through the year. With those limited resources, DPI has to prioritize. And the way they prioritize is they start with the most needy schools in the state. That becomes number one. And they simply then move themselves down that list as schools are lessening their need for services. So the thing that folks can realize that makes a difference is, for us, those things are things like losing teacher assistants. They're things like losing teacher allotment. Many of our listeners probably don't recognize that we haven't had professional development money for the last 10 or 12 years. And so when districts train teachers, they have to figure out how they're going to pay for that on their own. You see reductions in programs like career and technical education. You see reductions in health and PE. So those kinds of things that keep rolling out of the bag are really detrimental to a system like ours. So it is a cumulative effect, and each year that budget is reduced, you are seeing things that went away one year, and the next year you're adding on things that went away and are no longer available to a school system. So it's a really difficult time right now. For teacher assistants specifically, I credit our Board of Education. The board made a commitment for us to place teacher assistants in every K and first grade class across the district. We've been able to honor that commitment now for 2 years. We do give principals the flexibility to be able to temporarily use those teacher assistants in the upper grades if they choose to. But based on the number of kindergarten and first grade classes you have at that school, that's how many teacher assistants you get. So we're stretching that dollar about as thin as it can go.
Yeah, I just wanted to move when I was interested. You say you work for the DPI, Department of Public Instructions, and I know that same department this year is going to cut the budget by $3.2 million. With a propose of cutting $13.9 million next year for a total of $7.3 million. Tell us how that will affect the Elizabeth City School District.
Well, the first place I would go here is to say that a department that had a proven track record, and that was the Division of School Transformation, has basically been slashed. At one time, there were upwards of 300 employees in that division. Now it is down to 50. So when you look at that division and what they're charged with doing, it becomes crucial for districts like ours because you see things like helping new teachers grow and knowing how to teach. We sometimes forget that a brand new teacher, it takes about 3 years for them to get to a point where they're being effective in their teaching. They don't just come out of school and are ready to rock and roll and get it all done right the first year. So for us, it's things like curricular help, helping new teachers, providing funds for hard-to-staff schools. We have that issue in the entire Northeast, and it's no different for Pasquotank. These are all things that have either been reduced or they'll be eliminated from the state services. In terms of a practical matter, I'll give you a real thing. Funding for teacher and principal development now has been reduced down where there used to be regional meetings across the state and you could choose which site to go to. Now those have been generally reduced down to one site, and you have some of these are required things you have to go to, some of them are optional. But in practicality for us, once you get a location beyond Raleigh, then for our district, you have to add in the added cost of room and board for a night, because a person can't drive beyond Raleigh, participate in a full day activity, and drive back home. So it's real things like that continue to eat away at limited resources.
Yeah. The reason I'm staying on this and kind of harping on it because, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that throughout the years, even since 2009, they have cut the budget by $12 million for the schools itself. How are we going to survive? In this day and age with advanced technology, with things increasing, cost increasing, everything increase. And it's not just the instruction that we're talking about increasing, but the light bill increase, the gas bill increase, all these other things increase. And this is just $12 million that's cut out of the budget. But how are we going to, Mr. Superintendent, survive this system in looking for improvement in the school district, looking for improvement of the students without dollars that's essential to make this work? How are we going to do that?
Well, Hez, if I had the answer to that, we wouldn't be in the position we're in. Unfortunately, it comes down to having to make very difficult decisions. I'll go back to the teacher assistants. 3 years ago, we had teacher assistants based on the number of K-3 classes. So in order to facilitate and get around, so to speak, the reduction in that account, we went to having them in K-1. It is placing school districts in situations where we have to make difficult decisions. There are school districts in the state who have considered, I don't think there's anybody who's done it yet, but have considered pay to play for extracurricular activities, whether that's athletics or band or any other extracurricular activity. Those kinds of decisions are what we see for the future of education in North Carolina. This General Assembly has a very definite idea of what education should look like in our state. They are very pro-choice, and I'm not saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing. It just does take resources from the public schools and puts them into schools that are not held accountable for student admissions. Some of the schools that they're funding through opportunity scholarships and that kind of thing can turn away a student simply based on race, creed, national origin, any reason they want, and they would still receive that state funding. For those of us in public education who make it our mission to educate every child, no matter where they come from and what level they come from, that's very disturbing to know that the state is funding schools that can say no to a student just because that student doesn't fit the mold that they think they should.
Okay. So essentially, beyond the third grade, there aren't any teachers' assistants in the system now.
That's correct. Though principals do have the opportunity, if they wish to, and many of them do this, they may send an assistant to a third, fourth, or fifth grade class for like 2 periods, and so that those teachers do have some assistance. But that's a call that's made in each school.
Okay. And let's get to this, probably the last question here. There are many who blame the low-performing schools on students coming from poverty-stricken homes. Is there any truth to that statement?
Well, poverty is certainly one indicator, but it does not have to be the final factor. The reason that we have done so much professional development on poverty is it is an undeniable fact. Children who come from a background of poverty, that learning deficit, those children learn differently. It is not that they can't learn, it is just that they learn differently. So we would be foolish to say we're going to continue to teach this specific way, knowing that those students of poverty don't learn that way. So that's why we've done so much training with poverty. It's important, and you made a plug for parental involvement a while ago, but parental interaction, conversations, questions, building vocabulary, helping students speak in complete and correct sentences, those are all important things as well. If a child comes from an environment where the answers they receive to questions are one word, yes, no, be quiet, shut up, those kinds of things, then that's the child that's coming to us with learning deficits. But if a parent takes time to speak in complete sentences, to have the child speak in complete sentences, to expand, again, a real-life example. When you're going down the aisle in the grocery store, rather than just pulling something off the shelf and putting it in your cart, show to your child, this is oatmeal. What do we do with oatmeal? Ask questions like that. That's something that can be done, doesn't cost a bit of money. So those are the things. Yes, it's a problem. Is it insurmountable? No, we can overcome it, but we have to be really intentional about those interventions that I mentioned. The way we're going to change that is through intentional adults and caregivers who take the time to work with the child individually and build up that vocabulary, build up that sentence structure, build up being able to answer with more than one word.
Thank you very much. And I would just like to make an appeal to the community, again, in terms of getting involved in your child's education. And this is not just the parents itself. This is a grandparents, because many young people now are being raised by their grandparents, being raised by others. So we need you to just take some time out of your schedule and come and give this school district, and to not just necessarily the school district, but give the children and the administrators the support in the school district. And as I said again, the school district is open to your time. You set the time that you can appear at the school. You set the time that you can give to the school district. So we would like to try to encourage parents, grandparents, alumni, anybody to come and give us support, because this is reflection on all of us. It's just not the school district. This is reflection on our community. Let's see if we can do something to embrace the school district to the degree that we can help with this struggle and this dilemma that we're in, and the superintendent can't do it alone. The Board of Education can't do it alone. It takes all of us to work with the school district. So I beg of you, please, please, please give some time to the school district because they're our kids. Superintendent, thank you so much for coming. You've really been informative. We learned a lot, and that's why we are here. We try to let the public understand and try to give information that they don't get anyplace else. And where's a better place to get it from the superintendent? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hez. It's been a pleasure to be here, and I add my voice to encouraging folks to come out and volunteer. Come see us. There are great things happening. We do have some things we need to work on, but there are great things happening in our schools. Come see them.
Thank you for listening to Around the Town with Hez Brown, recorded and produced at WRVS-FM Studios on the campus of Elizabeth City State University. If you are interested in becoming an underwriter for this show, call 252-335-3985.